welcome to another lockdown conversation at the Foreign Desk, where I'm very lucky today to be bringing you a conversation with Ian Urbina from the New York Times. Ian joins me via Zoom from his home in Washington, D.C., and is an investigative reporter who has covered multiple stories regarding criminal justice across the US and around the world. His work has won a Pulitzer Prize for breaking news and a George Polk Award for foreign reporting, and in 2015 he had work nominated for an Emmy Award. Today we'll be discussing Ian's most recent project, the Outlaw Ocean, which is a really fascinating look at the shady, silent criminality that often exists at sea beyond the reach of law enforcement.
I think of the ocean as this space that has been kind of a metaphor for freedom, and it still is that. You know, it is a place that people go to escape rules and escape government and escape other people because it's so expansive. But those very allures of the space are what has made the ocean a scary place.
Don't take photos. Don't take photos. So I keep the camera down.
Few places on the planet are as lawless as the high seas. The ocean is a place of amazing beauty, but it's also this dystopian realm where severe inhumanities occur, and often with impunity.
Over.
What you realize when you're in that void or in that expanse is that most of that space is ungoverned and ungovernable. There are few laws, and what laws exist are murky and overlapping and contradictory. Laws are only as good as their enforcement, and the enforcement mechanisms for any of the laws are anemic at best. You have human trafficking, sea slavery, abuse of stowaways, weapons trafficking. When the UN looked at it in 2009 and they interviewed Cambodian deckhands, over 50% of them had witnessed murder. A lot of the forced labor that end up on these fishing boats are trafficked migrants and are very poor and easily taken advantage of. One mariner summed it up as, this line of work is like jail with a salary, except the salary is not guaranteed. We in the West would like to think that things are progressively getting better, and in many ways they are, but in this space, things are arguably getting worse. Over 99% of crimes that occur out there go unreported. And there's not a huge point in reporting them because it's never clear who would actually do anything with that information. I think if there's anything to be learned about human nature from the Outlaw Ocean, it's that we all have this visceral capacity to behave in ways that we thought civilization had stamped out. There's a vanishingly thin line between civilization and the lack of it. And I think the exploration of this frontier is an attempt to look at how thin that line is and what's on the other side.
So Ian, before we dive straight in there, let me just say thank you for your time. I realise your schedule is very tight, so thanks for your flexibility there. Let's begin with the Outlaw Ocean. It's a fascinating piece of work, albeit quite shocking in terms of what it confronts. Could you just perhaps talk me through a little bit more about the inspiration behind the project and how it came about?
So before I became a journalist, I was an anthropologist, and I took some time off from my doctoral work and wanted to get away from cold Chicago winters, and took a job on a ship that was anchored in Singapore. And that kind of confronted me with this realm of what I saw to be sort of a diaspora, a tribe of transient workers from whom you rarely hear much, but are super essential for the sort of commerce that makes the world go. Responsible for carrying 90% of the goods we consume, and we're a sizable population, to the tune of 50 million workers, and they had their own culture and language and code of conduct and hierarchy and crime. And so I kind of was captivated by that workforce first, and then secondarily was, had a boyish fixation with the blue on the map and sort of the sort of basic questions of, what it's like out there. And so the combination of those two curiosities stuck with me. And when I was at the Times, I began pitching the idea for a series that would take our readers out to that space and would focus on who those workers are and what are their experiences.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the book itself touches on quite a wide range of issues. As you say, it's a workforce of upwards of 50 million people who go very much unknown. Touching on human trafficking, a lot of environmental crimes. Something that I'd like to just dwell on for a moment was an issue that I found particularly shocking, and it was that of sea slavery and forced labour. Seems to be a particular issue in the fishing industry in Southeast Asia. And some of the stories in your book, especially relating to the Cambodian sailor who was trafficked and tricked into a job on the Thai fleet, was particularly harrowing. Could you tell our viewers a little bit more about how that practice operates and when you first became aware of the issue?
I mean, so one thing I would say is it's important to think of sea slavery as a bit of a spectrum. And on one end, you have the more acute and dramatic versions of this type of enslavement, and that's, migrant workers who come into a country and they're literally, captured and forced at gunpoint sometimes into a line of work from which they're not allowed to leave. And that's the sort of more brutal version of it. And then there's, on the other side of the spectrum, are softer but no less consequential versions of it in debt bondage, where someone perhaps knowingly comes into, say, from Cambodia into Thailand, intending to work in an industry, in this case fishing, but they accrue a debt on their way in that they have to work off. And that keeps them captive on the boat, and quite especially, as different from debt bondage in other industries like garment or coal or whatever, when you're at sea, the prospect of paying down your debt, the bookkeeping, your ability to leave and escape, and is much less. So that's one thing. It is also important, I think, to recognize that there's been a lot of attention on the South China Sea, the waters near Thailand, and how this issue plays out there, because it is bigger and more intense. There are more cases of it. It's a bigger fleet. And because of certain distinctions in the Thai economy being a relatively middle-class economy, and the surrounding countries, Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, being war-torn, very poor countries, there's a sort of perfect storm from a labor perspective scenario in which you have a lot of these cases occurring. But you go to the coast of Ghana, you go to the coast of the Falkland Islands, you go to the coast of Brazil, and you find a fair number of these similar sorts of situations. They're not, but yeah, I think you alluded to the standard model. Some migrant worker comes across the border desperate, looking for work, and ends up getting pipelined into the fishing industry. Off they go to sea. And in Lang Long's story, he attempted to escape. They caught him, brought him back, and whenever he wasn't working, he was shackled by the neck until someone paid for his freedom, and he was 2 years later, after being sold boat to boat, allowed to go back to land. And those stories are obviously the more acute version, but not unusual.
And it's what's quite surprising, quite harrowing, really, is the sense that this isn't something that's new. I was familiar with the term Shanghaiing, which I think has been around since the mid 19th century, where coercion and trickery is used.
Yeah,
it's been quite shocking to see that's still prominent today. Since the reporting, have you noticed any improvement? Have you noticed any actions, improvements in terms of checks taking place in port and inspection at sea?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Just the reporting is ongoing. The first 2 years of the series, the Outlaw Ocean, ran in the New York Times, and then took 2 years off to produce the book. The book came out 11 months ago. And we being my photographer and I, created a nonprofit organization so that we could continue for another 5-10 years of these stories, but not just for the Times, for other venues. So it's an ongoing journalistic endeavor. And throughout, as you said before, the point of the Outlaw Ocean was to highlight the diversity, to expand the taxonomy, if you will, of behavior out there, of characters out there, of what's happening in this lawless 2/3 of the planet frontier. And so the goal was to show breadth. Murder of stowaways post 9/11, intentional dumping of oil, arms trafficking, sea slavery, illegal whaling, abortions at sea, maritime repo men who steal ships on behalf of banks. There's just a wide range of characters and activity out there that most people were not aware of. And that was the point. And so when you ask, well, what has come of it, you have to sort of narrow it down of, well, which of the silos are we talking about?
Sure,
There's been a lot of progress in some, very little in others. On the issue of sea slavery, your interest, I think there is a fair amount of movement legislatively in the US. The EU has taken really interesting actions in its yellow-red card sort of toolkit to apply pressure on Thailand and Cambodia and other players in the region. There have been concrete, outcomes like a criminal prosecution of the guys that had Lang Long shackled by the neck. And I'm still in constant, just this morning, in fact, conversation with law enforcement in Thailand about other culprits that are involved in similar behavior. There's been also, in a more diffuse fashion, a sort of increased fluency in the public in general about these issues and awareness of, how complicated these supply chains are, how backwards and problematic seafood industry is in particular. So across the board, depending on your silo, there's been a lot of progress.
I guess given how secretive a lot of the operations are, certainly in relation to the seafood industry, the activities, they're obviously quite keen to keep those under the radar of the authorities. How did you manage to get the access that you did and get people to talk so candidly about their experiences?
I mean, I had the luxury of time to begin with. If you're a beat reporter, as you as a fellow journalist knows, and you're on a really tight timeline, you can't let relationships marinate. You can't let trust build through exposure and time. I had the luxury of time, and so could afford to go places and, spend a week just going out to dinner a couple times with a captain, and not even press him for candor. In some places I didn't have luxury time. You get on a ship and you're probably only going to be there for 24, 48 hours. You got to move fast and try to quickly establish the rapport you need. And, there are tactics that you and any journalist know about trying to just sort of instill trust in sources or interviewees. My general rule of thumb is if you're pretty open and transparent with people and you respect them, even people that you think are engaged in immoral or illegal activity, even just downright awful, evil activity, but you treat them as humans and even try to show that you've done your homework and you have a fluency as to what their perspective probably is and what their arguments for their views might be. I think if you can efficiently convey that to people in general, then you have much better chances of them feeling safe with you and opening up. And that, as a general rule of thumb, explains half of how I got people to talk.
I guess just touching on that, where you've got the as you say, the luxury of time. In the book, some stories come across as not going exactly to plan. Your time in Somalia, for example, where how would you explain that one? There was quite a few things that didn't.
Royal disaster. Yeah, I would explain it as I went in seeking one story, and I quickly found out that actually wasn't the story, and I was now in the middle of another story. I went in seeking a good news story, thinking that I would take a look at this breakaway state of Somalia, very lawless place called Puntland, which is really the Horn of Africa, and where a lot of stuff happens, arms trafficking and the piracy that we've seen in movies, but they were, from what I could tell, local authorities were seeming to crack down on illegal fishing and foreign industrial ships in their waters, stealing their resources. And
Mhm.
I thought, well, I'll go there and tell a different kind of story. I got there and very quickly found out that the better and more important story was a slavery story about this very dark fleet of 7 vessels that were in the waters, and quite with the permission and complicity and payoffs to the Puntland authorities. And indeed, the Puntland authorities and even the federal authorities were very much involved in the very problems that they bellyached about internationally. And so that felt like, from a journalistically honest point of view, the story I really needed to chase. But it ran me afoul with authorities locally for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
And my photographer and I ended up getting in a pretty tight bind.
It was explained to me by security forces within Puntland and in Mogadishu and abroad that there were 2 threats that were emerging. There was one internal and one external threat. The external threat was a threat that everyone faced, and that was ISIS and al-Shabaab. ISIS and al-Shabaab had been very active in the surrounding region, and in the days we were there had really stepped up their efforts in the surrounding villages and in and near the city. On the afternoon before we finally got out, al-Shabaab laid claim to the exploding of a bomb about 6 blocks from our hotel. So there was real concern that al-Shabaab was making a go at Bosaso, and hotels are a favorite target, and everyone in the city knew that there were these Westerners staying at this one hotel, and for that reason there was a good chance that they would try to hit the hotel. The internal threat we were hearing about was one that was emanating from within the Puntland government itself. This theory that had really become pervasive that we were CIA and we were there as part of a CIA effort to destabilize the local government. What we were hearing is that the hotel internally was not safe. There were lots of different armed groups, militias at the hotel, some of them staying there, some of them protecting it, some of them just hangers-on. It was a walled fortress, so a compound, but within that compound there are lots of different armed players, and it was not clear that all of them were trustworthy. So on the final night that we were there, the hotel manager, who was among those who was telling us that he was receiving intel that it was really unsafe for us to be there, but we had no place else to go. The roads were not safe for us to travel, leave the compound. There was no other hotel that was really thought to be even more secure. There were no commercial flights out. There were no private flights that we could even rent. So we were stuck until the next morning. And so we sort of devised a plan with the hotel manager. We had a meeting, and the plan was to stay in our rooms as much as possible. When night fell, move all our stuff into one room, keep the lights on, make it seem like we were in those rooms, and then discreetly late at night move to the roof. And on the roof, we'd be there with no one in the hotel knowing, except for a couple of the guards that our security guy most trusted, and we'd spend the night up there. Partially because you could see the whole surrounding compound better, and there were escape routes that you could figure out better, but partially also as a decoy. Everyone knew which rooms we were, but they didn't know that we weren't in those rooms. So that's what we did. Spent the last night on the hotel roof with a couple guards, armed guards. There was gunfire that night beyond the walls of the compound, but the compound was not hit, and 5 a.m. came not soon enough. We convoyed as fast as we could to the airport.
I wanted to come on to an element of safety which came up there. Seems like the bind there was being subject to quite a lot of unwanted attention, being the isolated Western reporters in Somalia. I was just wondering, how do you manage the unwanted attention? Obviously, with criminal activities, a lot of it's part of wider organised crime networks, and your work will be noticed in some fairly shady circles. How do you manage that risk?
How do I manage the risk? I don't. When I'm reporting in country, there are certain rules I impose on anyone who's with me in terms of commonsensical things. If you don't tell people why you're there and ahead of time where you're going, and we don't post stuff on social media about us in real time. Some journalists do that. We do not do that even until the story has run and we're out of the region safely, and we know that all our sources are ready and safe and in a place where they can afford to protect themselves, etc. And just in general, trying to keep a low profile, and then also just being studious about risk, vis-a-vis people that we might have irked with the topics we're covering, and thinking about when we return to that city or region, being mindful of the people that may not be happy with us when we go back in there, and trying to also be really efficient when you're on the ground, not spending too long in places. And also just, we run a pretty tight ship, and we don't carouse and make what I think are foolish social calls, oh, it's been a long day and let's go to the bar and hang out and decompress. I don't allow that really when we're doing reporting. We're not there to be at bars and hanging out, because those are exactly the contexts where things can go awry.
Yeah. Do you typically travel with a fairly small, tight-knit team? Is it maybe yourself and a photographer, or do you have researchers on location with you?
Usually it's a photographer or videographer. Usually that I try to have that be one person, myself, and then maybe a fixer translator. Usually one other person who has real local knowledge, language skills.
You refer to the seas, or the high seas, as being a largely ungovernable and ungoverned space. There are loose frameworks of legislation, the law of the sea. It's quite a porous framework, though. What do you think needs to be done to address that and address the shortcomings and the issues that you mentioned?
I mean, so in general, I think from an intellectual level, it's important to first recognize that to the extent that there are laws in the books, and to the extent that those laws are good, if we just take those two hypotheticals, the big lack then is enforcement. And 9 times out of 10, there are these grand laws or treaties or whatnot that are written with much fanfare, and the hidden truth is that nothing has been built into that thinks through the complexities and the costs and the political thorniness of actually policing that rule, whether it's a marine protected area or some new enforcement regime, whatever. They often haven't really sat down and said, okay, so this is great. How are we going to actually pay for the cops who are doing the investigations, pay for the satellite imagery to sort of see what's going on out there, change the laws so that prosecutions can happen when we find people acting this way, insulate those actors from political pressures like, well, we caught a Chinese ship, but the Chinese just gave us a huge loan, and now we're getting diplomatic pressure to look the other way. Like, all those things are often not thought about. And so these grand laws or treaties don't really have teeth. And so that's the biggest problem. And then again, going back to the silos of different types of problems, whether it's abandonment of seafarers, well, those solutions have to do with, there should be insurance that companies have to put up in case they go bankrupt, that pay to fly the guys home. Very nuts and bolts things. Or when it comes to overfishing, onboard cameras, crew manifests, you're never allowed to turn off your transponder. Like, they're very distinct lists. Murder of stowaways, arms trafficking, all have very mechanical, clear, often expensive, often politically difficult solutions, but they are distinct. But in general, I would say the things that cut across all of them are better and more aggressive and publicly accessible transparency and oversight. So being able to see who's doing what where. If an airplane leaves from one place to another in the post 9/11 world, it's not okay for it to go dark. It's not okay for anyone to know the manifest of who's on board and what they're carrying. That's not okay anywhere in the world, even if they're in international airspace. But it is okay in the maritime space.
Just to finish on, the Outlaw Ocean published back in 2019. I was just wondering what the next round of reporting is going to look like.
Yeah, so it's already begun to come out. The outlawocean.com is where it all lives. The nonprofit I created is essentially philanthropically funded, individual donor funded, to produce more stories, long investigative narrative, kind of only reported on site, not from land, about lawlessness in all its forms, human rights, labor, and environmental abuses offshore. And then that reporting ends up in the BBC, Guardian, NBC, the New Yorker, tier 1 venues around the world that have interest in it. And a month at NBC News, another story coming out in a couple months in the New Yorker, and about 3 other stories in the Atlantic, a separate story. And it's all these same issues, human rights and environmental crimes.
Well, I think we are just about out of time, so I think that's a pretty good place to end. Thank you so much for your time again today, Ian. I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you, and I'm sure my viewers will have as well. For my viewers, Ian's book, The Outlaw Ocean, is available online via Audible and from all good bookstores. I can't recommend it enough. Ian, thank you once again, and please keep up the great work. We're looking forward to hearing more from you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.